When I first moved into the neighborhood, I believed I had found the perfect place to call home. The houses were neatly lined up, the lawns were manicured, and the neighborhood carried that sense of quiet order that makes people feel safe and settled. On paper, it seemed ideal. I imagined peaceful mornings, friendly neighbors waving from across the street, and weekends spent enjoying the comfort of my own yard. But underneath that picture-perfect image, there was something lurking. I hadn't yet discovered the iron grip of the HOA, and at the center of it, a woman who would soon become my biggest problem. Her name was Karen, and she wore her title as HOA president like a crown. Every detail, from the length of your grass to the color of your shutters, seemed to matter more to her than the lives of the people around her. For me, it started small. Flyers tucked under my door reminding me of community guidelines I hadn't even broken. A sideways glance at my driveway when I parked an extra car. Petty reminders about approved exterior paint colors. It was as if she had a checklist ready to pounce on any new homeowner. Still, I tried to ignore her. After all, not every neighborhood has perfect harmony. Some people just need to feel in control. I figured as long as I followed the rules and minded my own business, things would eventually settle down. But I was wrong. Karen wasn't satisfied with enforcing small rules. She wanted power, and she wanted more property to go with it. My home happened to sit on a corner lot with a slightly larger yard than the others around it. To me, it was a bonus, a patch of land where I could plant trees, set up a small garden, and enjoy the extra space. To Karen, however, it was an opportunity. The first hint came during a casual HOA meeting. I attended just to introduce myself, thinking it would be a good way to meet neighbors. But instead of a warm welcome, I noticed Karen's eyes fixated on the layout of my property shown on a community map. She pointed at my yard and made a comment about how that land could serve the neighborhood better if it were part of the shared green space. At first, I laughed it off. Surely she wasn't serious, but the way she leaned in with that calculating look told me otherwise. Weeks passed, and the tension grew. Karen began to act as if part of my yard already belonged to the HOA. She'd walk her dog across my grass without asking. She'd stop in front of my property and measure invisible lines with her hands as if plotting something. One afternoon, I even caught her explaining to another neighbor how the HOA was working on reclaiming the extra land. My land, the more I watched, the clearer it became. Karen was preparing to challenge my ownership of my own property. What she didn't know, though, was that I had moved here with every intention of standing my ground. I had the deed, the surveys, and the patience to fight if it came to that. The storm hadn't hit yet, but I could see the clouds gathering. Karen wasn't just planning to make my life inconvenient. She was about to try to take what I rightfully owned. And when that day finally came, she would learn just how costly her obsession with control would become. Karen's intentions became clearer one morning when I walked out to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. At first glance, it looked official, the kind of document that makes your stomach tighten before you even read the words. The bold header read, "Notice of violation, unauthorized use of community land." I stood there, stunned. According to this violation, a portion of my yard, specifically the side section near the street, was being claimed as community property. The notice demanded that I remove my garden beds and restore the area to approved green space within 30 days. Failure to comply, it said, would result in escalating fines. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to process the audacity. My garden, which I had carefully planted, wasn't on community land. It was on my deeded property. I had walked the boundary lines myself when I bought the house, and the surveyor had confirmed it. There was no ambiguity. This was mine. Still, the HOA had made its first move, and I knew who was behind it. Karen. I spotted her later that day, pacing around the front of my property with a clipboard in hand. She glanced up, meeting my eyes with a smug expression that said she believed victory was already hers. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. I decided not to act impulsively. Instead, I gathered every piece of documentation I had: my deed, the property survey, and the purchase contract. I even contacted the county records office to double-check the official boundaries. Everything was clear. That strip of land was mine. There was no legal ground for Karen's claim, but logic and legality didn't matter to her. Within a week, I received the second blow, a letter from the HOA board demanding an immediate hearing to discuss my violation. The tone was threatening, full of legal jargon and hints of further consequences if I didn't comply. It was obvious Karen had rallied the board members to her side. She had power, influence, and the willingness to bend the truth to suit her agenda. At that meeting, the atmosphere was hostile. Karen sat at the head of the table like a judge presiding over a trial. She presented a map of the neighborhood, conveniently redrawn to show my side yard as part of the common area. She spoke with authority, claiming it had been misclassified during earlier surveys. To my surprise, some of the board nodded along, as if her words carried weight. I calmly presented my documents, sliding copies of the deed and the official survey across the table. My voice didn't shake, though inside I was boiling. I explained that my property lines had been clearly defined by the county and confirmed during the sale. Karen's map wasn't just inaccurate, it was fabricated. For a moment, the room was silent. I thought reason might finally prevail. But then Karen smirked and suggested the HOA could challenge the boundaries legally if necessary. She framed it as though the HOA was simply correcting an error, and I was the stubborn newcomer refusing to cooperate. It was then that I realized the depth of her determination. She wasn't going to stop at fines or notices. She was prepared to drag me into a legal battle, to try to strip me of what I rightfully owned. As I walked out of that meeting, I knew the fight had just escalated. Karen had drawn her line in the sand, and she was ready to cross it. But what she didn't understand was that I had more than just documents. I had time, resources, and the resolve to see this through to the end. That night, I stood in my yard, looking at the garden she wanted gone. The plants were thriving, the soil was rich, and the space carried the promise of everything I had worked for. It wasn't just dirt and grass. It was mine, legally and rightfully mine. Karen had fired the first shot, but the war was only beginning. Karen wasn't satisfied with warnings, meetings, or threats on paper. When I didn't cave after the so-called violation notice, she escalated her tactics in ways that turned daily life into a constant battle. It started with fines. The HOA began sending me monthly statements with charges for unauthorized land use. The numbers were outrageous, hundreds of dollars, stacking higher each month. I ignored them, knowing full well they were baseless. But every envelope in my mailbox carried the same aggressive red letters: pay immediately or face legal action. Then came the harassment. HOA volunteers, led by Karen herself, began patrolling near my property more often. I'd see them, clipboards in hand, snapping photos of my yard, pretending to take community maintenance notes. But it was obvious what they were doing: building a case. Karen wanted to make me look like a problem neighbor, the kind who disregarded rules and brought chaos to her orderly kingdom. The pressure didn't stop there. One afternoon, I found small wooden stakes driven into my lawn, painted with neon orange tips. They weren't mine. Someone, Karen no doubt, had placed them to mark off where she believed the property line should be. To the untrained eye, it looked official, as if the HOA had authority to move boundaries at will, but to me it was just another dirty trick. Neighbors began whispering, I noticed the change in their expressions when I walked by. Some avoided eye contact, others offered awkward smiles before quickly looking away. Karen had been busy spreading her version of the story, painting me as selfish and combative. According to her, I was refusing to cooperate with the HOA's efforts to make the neighborhood better. It didn't take long before the situation spilled into more public forms of intimidation. During the next HOA newsletter, there was a section vaguely titled "Resolving Property Disputes." It didn't mention my name, but it described a homeowner who was wrongfully occupying land intended for community use. It was obvious who the target was. Karen had turned my private fight into neighborhood gossip. The stress weighed on me, but I refused to back down. Each time I felt the pressure, I reminded myself of the deed locked safely in my filing cabinet. I had truth on my side, and no amount of gossip or fake fines could change that. Still, the constant harassment tested my patience. The final straw came when I returned home one evening to find part of my garden destroyed. The soil had been dug up, plants uprooted, and small orange flags lined the area as if claiming it for the HOA. I stood frozen, staring at the wreckage, anger boiling inside me. Karen hadn't just pushed me with fines and threats. She had crossed into vandalism. That night, I documented everything: photos, timestamps, copies of letters, even witness accounts from the few neighbors who quietly admitted they saw Karen inspecting my yard earlier. That day, I created a file thick enough to show a clear pattern of harassment and overreach. Karen thought she was tightening the noose around me, but what she didn't realize was that she was building the very case that would one day destroy her. The battle had gone beyond simple property lines. Now it was about power, intimidation, and who would outlast the other. And while Karen was confident the HOA shielded her from consequences, I was preparing to bring the fight to a much larger stage, one where her arrogance would finally meet reality. The letters, the fines, the harassment, all of it had been leading to this moment. Karen and the HOA finally filed a lawsuit against me, claiming I was unlawfully occupying land that belonged to the community. When the papers arrived at my door, heavy with legal jargon and accusations, I knew the game had officially changed. For Karen, this was her moment of triumph. She walked around the neighborhood with an air of victory, announcing to anyone who would listen that the HOA was finally putting an end to the problem. To her, I wasn't a neighbor. I was an obstacle to be crushed publicly. She believed that once the matter reached the courtroom, her word as HOA president would outweigh anything I had to say. But Karen underestimated me. I came prepared. My file of evidence had grown thick with every incident I documented. The phony violation notices, the photos of vandalism, the stakes planted in my yard, and even the newsletter where she indirectly smeared my name. Most importantly, I had the legal foundation, my deed, the county survey, and certified boundary maps. These weren't opinions or neighborhood rumors. They were facts, stamped and filed by the government. The day of the hearing arrived, and the tension was heavy in the air. Karen walked into the courtroom dressed as though she were attending a royal coronation, chin high, eyes sharp, clutching her binder of papers that she believed would seal my fate. Behind her sat a few board members, nodding with rehearsed loyalty. To them, this was a chance to reinforce the HOA's power over every homeowner. The proceedings began with Karen's attorney laying out their argument: that the property line had been drawn incorrectly, that my yard encroached on community space, and that I was refusing to comply with repeated HOA directives. They even produced Karen's redrawn map as evidence, as though it carried the same weight as an official survey. I sat quietly, listening, resisting the urge to shake my head. Their entire case rested on fabricated boundaries, and Karen's authority. But authority isn't proof. When it was my turn, I rose and presented the documents. The deed came first, showing the legal description of the land as it was sold to me. Then the survey, signed by a licensed professional, with clear boundary markers that matched the land I occupied. Finally, county records that confirmed those. Same boundaries in black and white. The judge examined them carefully, and I could see the shift in the room. The tone changed. Facts had a way of cutting through arrogance like a blade. Karen's smirk faltered. For the first time since this began, she didn't look untouchable. But I wasn't finished. I introduced the evidence of harassment, the photographs, of the vandalized garden, the flags and stakes planted in my lawn, and the newsletters that spread false claims. Each piece painted a clear picture. This wasn't about community land. It was about a personal vendetta. Karen had abused her power as HOA president to target me, and in doing so, she had crossed the line into intimidation and destruction. The judge leaned back, clearly unimpressed with the HOA's argument. Karen tried to interject, her voice rising, insisting that the HOA's role was to protect the community. But the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded. The courtroom wasn't her HOA meeting room. She couldn't silence me, couldn't bend the truth without consequence. By the end of the session, the decision was clear. The judge dismissed the HOA's claim, ruling that my property was legally mine and that the HOA had no authority to seize. Not only that, but the judge also acknowledged the harassment and warned Karen and the board that further actions against me could result in penalties. Karen sat frozen, her face drained of the smug confidence she had carried for months. The weight of defeat settled on her shoulders as she realized she had lost not just the case, but the image of power she had worked so hard to project. For me, the verdict was a breath of relief, but I knew the war wasn't entirely over. Karen wasn't the kind to walk away quietly. This loss had humiliated her, and humiliation often drives people to darker measures. As I left the courtroom, documents in hand and head held high, I knew this was only one battle won. The war with Karen and the HOA she controlled was far from finished. The courtroom loss was supposed to end it all, but Karen wasn't the type to quietly admit defeat. If anything, losing had made her more dangerous. She returned to the neighborhood with a simmering fury, determined to find another way to assert her power and reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. At first, her actions were subtle. She began over-monitoring other neighbors, sending warning letters and enforcing rules with unprecedented strictness. Every minor infraction became an opportunity to display her authority. The HOA board, shaken by the court ruling but still loyal to her, followed her lead. The neighborhood that once seemed peaceful now felt tense, like walking through a minefield of petty regulations and watchful eyes. But her most reckless moves were reserved for me. She tried to escalate the situation by involving outside inspectors, claiming code violations that didn't exist. She encouraged the HOA to plant signs, warning that parts of my yard were off-limits and under community review. She even approached contractors to try to force the removal of my fencing, suggesting it encroached on community property. Karen's attempts were clumsy, desperate, and increasingly visible to the neighbors. Slowly, word spread. People began noticing the pattern. She had lost in court, yet continued to harass a homeowner who was clearly within their rights. Her reputation, carefully constructed over years of petty control, started to crumble. Neighbors who had once nodded along with her orders now whispered behind her back. They had seen the letters, the photos, and the unnecessary fines. They understood that Karen had abused her position, and her obsession with my property had revealed her true character. Even board members began to distance themselves, Some quietly admitted they had been following Karen out of fear, not agreement. Others questioned her judgment openly, asking why the HOA had wasted so much time and energy targeting a lawful homeowner. Karen, once untouchable, now faced isolation and criticism from every corner of the neighborhood. Her desperation became more erratic. She began sending aggressive letters accusing me of threatening the community and ignoring HOA authority. She called multiple emergency meetings to try to rally support, but fewer people showed up each time. The very tools she had used to control others, fear, authority, and intimidation, were now turning against her. Meanwhile, I quietly documented every interaction. Each aggressive letter, each false claim, and every overreach by the HOA became part of a growing record. Unlike Karen, I wasn't acting out of ego or vengeance. I was building a shield that would protect me and expose her. One afternoon, a group of neighbors approached me, expressing relief and support. They admitted they had felt intimidated before, but seeing Karen push so far, so recklessly, had opened their eyes. Some offered witness statements, others shared photos they had taken, and a few promised to attend any future HOA meetings. The neighborhood was shifting. Karen was losing her grip, and the community was beginning to see her as the problem, not me. By the end of the chapter, the situation had fully flipped. Karen, once the dominant force in the neighborhood, was now isolated, reckless, and desperate. Every move she made to regain control only widened the cracks in her authority. The stage was set for the final act. The HOA, under Karen's reckless guidance, had overstepped, alienated the community, and painted themselves into a corner. It was only a matter of time before her obsession with my property would backfire in a way she could never recover from. By the time the final chapter of this saga began, the neighborhood had witnessed months of tension, intimidation, and legal battles. Karen, once the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had become a cautionary tale of how obsession and abuse of power can destroy even the most carefully constructed facade. Her desperation reached its peak when she attempted one last move, filing a complaint with the county to challenge my property lines again. She claimed new evidence that supposedly showed my yard encroaching on community land. But this time, the county officials were thorough, having been briefed on the prior court ruling and supplied with my extensive documentation. Her claims were quickly dismissed as baseless and frivolous. Word of Karen's repeated harassment spread beyond the neighborhood. The county issued a formal warning to the HOA about misuse of authority, citing their actions against me as harassment. Rather than legitimate community oversight, it was a public rebuke that could not be ignored. Karen's name became associated with petty vendettas and reckless leadership. Meanwhile, the neighbors, who had quietly observed the entire conflict, began speaking out. Several attended HOA meetings armed with evidence of her overreach, presenting a united front that exposed the pattern of abuse. Karen found herself facing not only legal consequences, but also a complete loss of support within the community she had once ruled. The tables had turned entirely. For me, the victory was not just legal, it was personal. I restored the areas of my yard that had been damaged, adding new plants and trees as a symbol of resilience. The soil that Karen had tried to claim, manipulate, and even destroy was now flourishing more than ever. My property was my own, and this time the triumph was undeniable. Karen's final humiliation came when the HOA board, faced with mounting criticism and the county's intervention, voted to remove her as president. She was stripped of authority, isolated, and unable to intimidate anyone further. The neighborhood that had once feared her now watched her fade from influence entirely. Her obsession with my property, which had fueled months of conflict, had been the very cause of her downfall. In the aftermath, peace returned to the neighborhood, The HOA, humbled and restructured, focused on reasonable guidelines rather than personal vendettas. Neighbors who had once been silent came forward, sharing their support and rebuilding trust. My home, my property, and my garden became symbols of perseverance and justice, a reminder that standing up for what is right can triumph over even the most overbearing opposition. As for Karen, the lessons were hard and public. She had learned the ultimate cost of abusing power, loss of authority, credibility, and community respect. My property remained untouched, my rights fully recognized, and the message was clear. Intimidation and manipulation have consequences. And so, after months of tension, legal battles, and relentless harassment, the chapter closed. My property was safe, my boundaries respected, and the neighborhood had restored its balance. What began as a simple dispute over land had transformed into a story of courage, resilience, and the triumph of right over wrong. The moral of the story was unmistakable. No matter how powerful someone thinks they are, overreach and obsession will always have a price, and standing firm in the face of injustice can turn the tide in your favor.